Well, that last tape ran out before I could complete what I was going to say. I was going to tell you that one day the company sergeant major ordered us all out on parade, all his company at any rate, and inquired if there were any tradesmen. Well, of course, I was an apprentice to electrical instrument making, so I gave my name in. I had no idea what they wanted it for. I just acquiesced to what they asked. But I forgot all about it. And just until, it was weeks later, when looking at the battalion orders on the battalion notice board, I saw the following notice. The following men will report to Woolwich Arsenal for a trade test. And my name was amongst them. And I realised then what the idea was of the sergeant majors in asking for tradesmen. So I reported to the orderly room and got my travelling warrant, and off I went to Woolwich Arsenal. And I was there a couple of days doing engineering work, the kind that I did it when I was at home at the BI. And then at the end of the test, I reported back to my battalion, and again I heard nothing more. Well, in between this, the one Saturday night, when most of the men were out in town, some in the cinemas and some in the various clubs and places like Sunday school halls and places that were open for soldiers to go into and spend an hour or two. And most of the men were out. And in the cinemas, there was suddenly a notice flashed on the screen. And this notice was also passed to the various clubs, which said that all men of the 66 East Lancashire Division must report immediately to camp. Well, they all came flooding back to camp. When I got back to camp, I joined the machine gun section, and our officer was there, and he said, well, you might be using your machine guns, men, before the night's over. So he didn't tell us any more. We had to fall in full kit, everything. We got the limber that carried the machine guns, and we joined the battalion, and off we set off towards the East Coast. Well, it wasn't we kept on marching towards the East Coast, and nobody told us why or what the alarm was about. And we'd been marching for about 10 miles, and we were getting near the East Coast when we were ordered to deploy at the side of the road. There was a long wood stretching down a field, and we had to deploy into this wood. And it was only then that we were told why we'd been called out. And it appeared that some German warships had been seen heading for the East Coast, for the coast of Essex, that was. And they probably were just coming on a raid. But evidently the powers that be thought it might be the beginning of an invasion. And so we were called out to help to repel this invasion. Well, we moved to the side of the wood that was nearest to the sea, and we set up our machine guns all ready, and we waited there in a ditch all night long. Nothing happened. And then in the morning, we were told to fall in again, and the field kitchens. Those are kind of boilers and ovens that you take along with you when you march in any distance, so that you can have hot meals. Well, we were served up with hot breakfast from these field kitchens, and then we set off and had to march back to camp. And that was the end of that. Now, about a week later, there was another notice board. There was another notice on the notice board. Of course, we used to go and read the battalion orders every morning. And I went to read the battalion orders this morning, and it appeared that I'd passed my test at Woolwich Arsenal, and I was being transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. And I had to proceed to Farnborough in Hampshire. That was the headquarters of the Royal Flying Corps at that time. So I had to pack all my things up and get my travelling warrant again, and off I went to the Royal Flying Corps. Well, I remember arriving at Farnborough station on the train, and on the same train that I'd come down on from London, had to go through London, there was a lot of fellas in civilian clothes, and there were young men from London who were joining the Flying Corps, but they were only just joining at that particular time. And when we got off the train, there was a couple of military police on the station. There's always plenty of military police about in these where there was any troops stationed, and they got us all outside the station, and one of the sergeants of the military police, he shouted, "Are there any transfers from the infantry here?" So I said I was a transfer from the infantry. So he said, "Here, I'll take charge of all these men and march them up to the Royal Flying Corps depot." So I had to form them, get them in fours and march them up to the Royal Flying Corps depot. Well, when we had to pass the Royal Aircraft Factory on our way, and there was sentries outside the Royal Aircraft Factory, and I had to give the order, I was right, because when troops passed a sentry, they had to present arms. And anyway, we passed that, and we got to the Royal Flying Corps depot in Farnborough Village. Well, it's in between Farnborough Village and Aldershot, really. And we were all lined up outside, and it was in January, and it had been a severe winter. The wind was blowing, and it was really icy, and we were all starved standing there while they called us all in one by one and took all the particulars. And we were standing there from about dinner time to nearly tea time before we'd all got registered, and then we were taken along to some old barracks, the barracks that had been inhabited, used by the regular army in the old days. In fact, they had old names like Blenheim and Oudenarde, and all names of old battles they were. But we got settled there for the night, and then the next day I was called out, and I had to go and take another trade test in the Royal Aircraft Factory. And it took about another 3 days then. I was given various instruments to repair and various little jobs to do, and had to describe how an aneroid worked and all. An aneroid, it's the thing that measures the height that the aeroplane flies at. And all those different things. It was like an examination. But anyway, I must have come through that, because a bit later, a few days later, there was another order that I had to proceed to a wireless school. It told me that I was going to be a wireless mechanic, and I had to go to this wireless school for tuition. And this wireless school was at a place called Brooklands near Weybridge. And Brooklands, of course, was a motor racing track, and there used to be a big well, I don't know exactly what you'd call it, but it was a building where the people who went watching racing could go and get refreshments and all that sort of thing. And that was to be our headquarters. We were going to sleep there. But although we slept there, the place where the school was at the other end of this Brooklands race track. And I had to go there and learn all about wireless and learn how to take wireless sets to pieces and repair them and all that sort of thing. And there wasn't much happened really while we was there. That's because that was the main thing. We were just learning. There was only one thing that happened, and that was while we were there was a fire in one of the hangars. And this hangar was really the canteen, where you could go and get cigarettes and tobacco and cakes, and drink a tea or anything like that. And again, first of all, we were woke up in the middle of the night, and we all had to march. Well, we had to run down. We had to go at the double, as they called it. We had to go at the double to this hangar that was on fire to help to put it out, because the fire brigade, in fact, there was only one. It was only just getting there by the time we arrived, because they were drawn by farm horses, and they had to go and catch the horses, get the horses out the stables first before they could bring the fire engine. But anyway, that by the way. The main thing is that next it almost burned itself out, and the next day, again, because I was an ex-infantryman, I was put with one or two other men as a sentry over this particular part of the hangar where the fire had been. Well, I was searching amongst the embers. Well, they weren't really embers then because they cooled down, but you could say the rubbish that it had left behind. I was just searching amongst it for no particular reason when I saw a tin box. And I picked up this tin box and opened it. It was rather difficult to open the lid. It seemed stuck. But when I opened the lid and looked inside, it was full of silver coins, but they'd all melted in the heat, and they'd all run into one lump. Well, looking back on it, I'm sorry to say that I put the thing in my pocket, because I thought, oh, well, that's a souvenir. And of course, in those days, in the army, in cases like that, it wasn't supposed to be stealing. They used to call it scrounging. So I scrounged this box with all the silver coins stuck together and melted. And I remember I took it home and left it there. And I don't know what happened to that. I've forgotten, because I'd only took it more as a souvenir than anything else. But that was about the only thing that worth mentioning while I was at this wireless school. But at the end of 6 weeks, I returned to Farnborough, and I was immediately given 3 days embarkation leave. That meant I was going to France, and I had my 3 days leave at home, and then I came back to the depot, and the next morning I was a part of about 200 men who were going to France as reinforcements to take over from fellas who'd been wounded and all that sort of thing. But I can remember getting on the train at 8 o'clock in the morning at Farnborough, and we went by train to Southampton. When we got to Southampton, we didn't go into the main railway station. The train took us straight into through the docks, right to onto where the ships were, and it almost stopped almost opposite where the ship where we was going to get on later on. The ship was there, but we weren't allowed to get on it. We were all paraded outside the ship on the wharf, or whatever you call it, and it was about dinner time by the time we got there. So we'd been given what they call iron rations. That's bully beef and hard biscuits, and we were allowed to eat a lunch. And then about the middle of the afternoon, we were still waiting to go on the ship, but they wouldn't let us go on. And then we found out the reason why we weren't allowed on, because the middle of the afternoon, along came a train, and of course it came right up to the railway lines, ran right up onto onto the wharf and right alongside the ship. And there was no passengers on. It was absolutely full of mail bags, and of course they were all going to the troops in France. And we were given the job of unloading these mail bags from the train, and then from the ship they were letting cranes down to lift them all up and store them on deck. And we were doing that till about 5 o'clock at night. Then we were allowed to go on then, on the ship. But although we were on it, we didn't start off. The ship didn't start to move until it'd be about 9 o'clock, when it was begin to get dark. And it went up what they call the Solent. That's in between the mainland of England and the Isle of Wight. And when we got to the tip of the Solent, looking towards the west, the ship stopped again. And we had to wait there until it was pitch black, so that we could cross the channel, because there was the fear of submarines, German submarines, torpedoing us. And actually we didn't start from the edge of the Isle of Wight till midnight. And then I remember I was getting a bit tired, and I took my pack off and I'd got all my full pack and everything on. And I remember lying down on the deck, and I must have gone to sleep. because the next thing I remember was that searchlights were being shone onto the ship. And after a bit they went off, and then as we got nearer to the French coast, we could see that they were French destroyers. They'd come in to escort us in. And we arrived opposite Le Havre, but we didn't get off the ship at Le Havre. We arrived there early morning, about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we were stuck outside Le Havre until about dinner time. And the reason for that was that we were going down the River Seine, and we were going to disembark at Rouen. Now, of course, where you have a tidal river, you've got to wait until the tide comes in, until the river, there's enough water in the river to float a big boat like ours. Although ordinarily they would take small boats, but with big boats they had to wait till the tide came in to give them the necessary depth underneath the ship. And so we started down at midday, and it took us all afternoon. It was 6 o'clock at night by the time we arrived at Rouen. And one thing I remember about the journey down, that whenever we passed anywhere there was French people, they were all waving, and and I thought to myself at the time, well, you'd have thought with the number of our troops that had been going down that way in the last year or so, that they got a bit used to seeing us, and they wouldn't have taken any notice, but they seemed to get quite excited. One fellow with a pitchfork in the field, he was pretending to bayonet somebody with this pitchfork. I suppose it was the Germans. But anyway, we got to Rouen that night at 6 o'clock, and we disembarked from the ship, and we were marched to a camp that was right outside Rouen. When you got so far out of Rouen, you came to quite a gradient, and we had to march up this gradient, and at the top of this gradient we came upon a big camp. Oh, it was a massive camp, and it was filled with our troops, and this is where we had to wait until we were ready to go up the line by train. And I always remember there was a lot of Indians. They were Indian cavalrymen, Bengal Lancers they called them. But there was all these. And it was Saturday on this particular day when we arrived in this camp, and because we were new to France, we weren't allowed into the town of Rouen at night. In fact, we weren't allowed in at all, either night or day. There was a kind of a checkpoint where if a man had been in France before and he was used to the place, they would allow him to go into Rouen at night. But for any of us who'd just come out for the first time, I suppose they were protecting us against different things, but the military policemen wouldn't let us go in. So we had to fill up our old time in the camp. And a lot of this time was taken by playing housey, as they called it. Today we call it bingo. But that's what they used to call it, housey. And we'd be playing this housey all day long. There'd be one or two of the old-timers running it, and they'd be shouting the numbers out, and we'd have our little cards in the as we sat round outside the tent in the daytime. But there was nothing really happened there because we were just waiting. And then on the Tuesday afternoon, we were marched down to the railway in Rouen. We didn't go into the railway station, we were marched into the goods yard. And there was a big goods train with the goods wagons on. And on the outside of these, it was printed 40 hommes. Well, that was 40 men. So that 40 men had to get in one of those goods trains. They could either have 40 men or 8 chevaux, which is 8 horses. And, well, I never travelled so slow anywhere. I don't know where it took, because we seemed to be just travelling along through the French countryside, and every so often the train would stop for a bit, and when it did, some of us who wanted a drink would take our billy cans and we'd go up to the engine driver and we'd put some tea in billy can and get him to put some hot water from the engine in to make a drink. But that, by the way, we kept on going until we got to, well, I don't know where it was really. It was, but I do know that it was number 2 depot. It was number 2 Royal Flying Corps depot in France. Of course, this was well behind the lines still, and we arrived there about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we just detrained, and there was a field at the side of the railway station, and with some tents in, and we had to go and stop there until 8 o'clock because it was a depot. I remember the name now. It was called Candas. The place was Candas, at number 2 Royal Air Force Depot. And the reason we had to wait till 8 o'clock was because it was more like headquarters with offices and all that, and we were going there, and from there we would be distributed to different squadrons, to whichever part of France the squadron happened to be in. Well, and it was more like offices. Well, we got there to this depot, and of course they hadn't got tap water on, but there was a well in the grounds. It was in a big French house, this headquarters was, and there was a well in the grounds, and they had us drawing water out of the well all day long. They always found you something to do if they could in the army. And we kept on doing that till 6 o'clock at night. And then we were marched back to the railway station. And again, with no idea where we were going, we just went to the station and had to wait until we were given instructions. But we were marched down to the station and got on another of the same kind of thing. And off we went again. Well, we were moving very slow. I don't know why it was that they had to go slow, but it seemed to take hours to cover about 20 miles. And as we were going, after we'd been going along a bit, we began to realise we were getting near the front line because we could see the gun flashes in the sky. And we kept on going on till we came to a station. The only people who were in the station were what they used to call ROD men, and because they were in the army, but they'd evidently been railway men in civil life, and they put them in charge of these stations because the civilians had all left, you see. And we got off at this station, and again at the side of the station was this field with a row of tents in. So we were told, go and get in one of those tents and wait until you're called. Well, while we were sat waiting all that morning, every now and again a Royal Flying Corps man would come along with a tender. A tender is a kind of a motor. It wasn't like a motor. The same thing they use for delivering things, you know, motor van. It was more like a motor van, but it had seats down the side so that men could sit inside. And they call them, well, they were made by a firm named Crossley in Manchester, Crossley Tenders they were called. And the driver of the tender would come along and he'd be shouting the names out of somebody, and these men would go out, and that would be the end of them as far as we were concerned. Well, it got nearly dinner time before one came and shouted Finney and somebody else. I forget who the other man was, but anyway, there was two of us. So we went out and we got in this tender, and we started asking him questions, and we wanted to know where the squadron was that he was taking us to, but he told us it was in the Somme area, and that was about as much as he could tell us. But it was tea time before we arrived at this squadron, and I found out it was number 3 squadron. And number 3 squadron, it was what they call an artillery squadron. That meant it worked with the artillery. We worked with the 17th Corps Artillery. And this squadron, the aerodrome, had been a French aerodrome before we'd taken it over, because at the beginning of the war we only had a short stretch of front, and we'd gradually lengthened the front as more men went out from England, until for the Battle of the Somme we'd taken over more of the French sector. So this was a French aerodrome. And this number 3 squadron was one of the oldest squadrons in the British Army. Now, there was only 3 squadrons went out with the original expeditionary force, and the place where we'd landed was behind a town called Albert. It was just off the Albert Amiens Road. And when the Battle of the Somme first started, the front-line trenches were only just a little bit to the east of Albert, and our aerodrome was just the opposite side, the western side, just behind the town of Albert. But of course, as the Somme battle went on and they pushed the Germans farther away, it meant that our aerodrome began to get further and further in the rear. And because our aeroplanes were slow, the top speed was about 90 miles an hour. They had to be slow for the job of working with the artillery, because they had to spot for them. But as I was saying, as the Germans got pushed further and further away, we were being left further and further behind, and that wasn't much good to us, because they could only stay in the air about 3 hours at the most. In fact, that was about the limit, 3 hours. And of course there was the distance they had to travel to the line, and the distance coming back, and they'd always got to keep that certain amount of petrol in reserve in case anything went wrong. So it was necessary for us to be as near the line as possible. But it was quite a problem on the Somme, because as the battle went forward, the ground was that messed up. It was simply one mass of old trenches and shell holes. There wasn't a place where an aeroplane could land. You couldn't, let alone make a new aerodrome. So it meant that we had to stay behind for quite a long time before we could move forward. There's one thing I'd just like to tell you, that the number 3 squadron was the only Royal Flying Corps squadron in France that flew monoplanes. All the rest were biplanes. And this was a French machine. It was called the Maran. And they were very difficult, although they were good machines to fly, they were very difficult to land, because most of the pilots had been trained on biplanes, and when they came to land on a monoplane, they found out it was a lot more difficult to do. And very often some of the new pilots who came out from England, they smashed the plane up on the first landing, and some of them were sent back to England for more training. I can always remember that. But as I say, because we were getting further, and the time came when the Battle of the Somme had to finish. That was because it was getting winter and it was getting worse and worse. The troops couldn't march, they couldn't move the guns, they couldn't move anything. It was that thick with mud, and with everywhere being smashed up, there was nothing they could do in winter. So the Germans have been getting the worst of it in the end. And during the winter, both sides quietened down a bit. And while they were doing that, the Germans were building a new, stronger line further back. And our infantrymen in the trenches in the front, one morning suddenly awoke to the realisation that the Germans had gone. They'd just left 1 or 2 machine gunners behind in the trenches to give the impression that they were still there, because every now and again they would let off with the machine guns, and our fellows thought they were still there. But actually the main part of the German army had gone back. And after they'd gone back, they went quite a way back. About 6 miles back, and they went about 4 miles behind Bapaume. That was another French town, and from Albert to Bapaume it was one mass of trenches and holes and villages were just a heap of bricks. There's hardly a tree standing. They'd all been blown to pieces by the shell fire and that. And so what we had to do was, when the Germans retired, there was a stretch of land for about 4 miles that hadn't been damaged by shell fire, of course, because we hadn't known that they'd retired. And so we decided to have what they call an advanced landing ground. And as I was surplus to requirements at the time, I'd been sent out as a reinforcement, they sent me to this advanced landing ground, and of course I had to go right across the battlefield to get to it. So I had a real view of what things had been like on the Somme. And there was a road leading from Bapaume to a village called Frémicourt, and our temporary aerodrome was at the side of this road. By the way, there was only six of us there. You know, there was a couple of engine fitters and a couple of other. There was one armourer to see to any trouble with the machine guns on the planes, and there was also the men who looked after the body and wings of the plane. We had one cook. We had one cook to cook for us, and we had some good meals while we were there because he knew how to cook under difficult circumstances. But I was there for quite a bit. What would happen was that if any of our aeroplanes got hit over the lines, but they hadn't been brought down, they'd been damaged and couldn't get back to the squadron, they had to land on this advanced aerodrome. And whatever the fault was, if we could put it right, we used to do so that they could fly back to the squadron. And it was same as in the case of a pilot might have his wireless damaged, or anything could happen while he was out on doing a shoot, as they called it, with the batteries. And I was there for quite a time, and I really enjoyed it. But at the end of that time, the powers that be had decided that it was safe enough for the whole squadron to move forward. So we went back and joined the squadron. I might say that while I was with the squadron at its old aerodrome near Albert, I had one afternoon I was given leave to go into Amiens, so I was able to have a look at the town of Amiens and go in a cafe and have a tea. It was all interesting, you know, going in a strange country and knocking about. And so later on, we all moved up. The whole squadron moved up to a aerodrome in a place called Longuevains, and part of the squadron had to go very early in the morning, so that they'd be there to receive on the new aerodrome. They'd be there to receive the aeroplanes as they landed on the new aerodrome. Of course, the main body of the squadron would stay behind and see to the machines and clearing up at that end. And I know I was one of those who was, with having been on the aerodrome before, or rather been on the advanced landing ground, I was one of those who was sent forward in the early morning to wait for the squadron, and it was get ready for them. And it was night time before the full squadron came along. I think that's about as much as I can tell you just at the moment. There were two happenings of interest while we were on the aerodrome at Longuevains. The first one was that our troops were making an attack on a place called Guillemont Farm. This was held by the Germans, and it was rather a strong point, and our troops were trying to take it from the Germans. And because we were the nearest to this particular point, and very near to the line as well, all the aeroplanes taking part in this attack were ordered to come down on our aerodrome if any trouble developed, if the pilots or the gunners were wounded, or if the planes got damaged and they had to land. And of course it was quite a busy morning for us, because they were coming down. There was no end of our planes came down with the damage that had been done to them, and in some cases with either the gunner or the pilot wounded. I remember one particular plane, because I had to get inside to help the gunner out, and the floor of the plane was covered in blood. He'd been wounded in the leg, in the thigh part of his leg, and it had bled very profusely. And I know my boots were all covered in blood when I was helping to get him out. And then the following, our troops managed to succeed in their effort to take this farm, but the next day the Germans counterattacked in an attempt to take it back. And I can remember that I wasn't particularly busy at that time, and I climbed onto the top of the hangar to see if I could see what was going on, and I could see the German attack taking place. The shells were bursting all over our trenches and behind the trenches, but anyway, they didn't get through. Our troops managed to keep them off. That was the first thing of interest. The second one was to do with an attack that was planned, but it was planned for a week or two ahead of this particular time, and this was going to take place about 5 miles from where we were, but that part of the front was covered by our aeroplanes, the planes from our squadron. And we had with us a wireless operator who could speak German, and he understood German well, and it was his job to listen to the broadcast from Germany and from anything that was being sent out by any of their planes, and to report it to our intelligence. Well, here again, in order to do this, do it well, and he had to be very near to the front lines. And of course it would be too dangerous for him to be above ground, so I was sent with one or two others to dig a